Good morning. Thank you very much for that introduction. I'm delighted to be here and to speak with you about a topic that is near and dear to my heart and something with which I am frequently engaged, not just in Africa, but around the world, and that is the cooperation regarding maritime security. Now, if you are anything like me, when you watch a film or a TV show, you don't like to know what's going to happen before it happens. But unfortunately for you, I'm going to go ahead and spoil my own talk and start with my conclusion. I'd like to conclude with 3 points. We're going to discuss how maritime security frameworks at the moment form a patchwork of cooperation rather than a seamless framework of frameworks. And so the first conclusion is going to be that this patchwork of frameworks needs to evolve into a framework of frameworks, and we'll explain that. The second conclusion concerns the level of these frameworks and the level of cooperation within them. Because at the moment, we have cooperation at the top level and at the bottom level, but we're missing the middle. And ultimately, we're going to conclude that the middle needs to be legally grounded. And finally, cooperation has to be cooperative. In other words, it really needs to work. And so, in a very glib manner, we're going to conclude with the notion that cooperation must quack like a duck. And I'll explain that as we go along. So now, having completed the conclusion, let's start at the beginning. Around the world at the moment, nations are coming to terms with their maritime domains. There's a whole spectrum from which maritime countries do or do not fully exploit their maritime capability and capacity. Being a coastal island or archipelagic state does not make a state a maritime nation. And over the last few years, many states all over the world have started the process of really trying to engage with strategies that will turn them from where they are, at whatever level, into a more full and complete maritime nation. No country on earth has fully reached its maritime potential. And so we are all working in that direction. The last 2 years in particular, the world has seen what seems to be a bonanza of maritime strategies at the national and regional levels. The US, the UK, Portugal, the EU, NATO, many others have all published national and regional and intergovernmental strategies concerning maritime security. And this is a very good signifier of overcoming what is often termed as sea blindness. In other words, our unwillingness to really recognize the potential and the value of the maritime domain. In Africa, this process is occurring as well and at an incredible pace. And it's occurring at the local, the national, the regional, the interregional, and the continent-wide levels, all at once. The problem is that frameworks are being created, but they're often being created in isolation. So one of the big challenges facing Africa at the moment is the compartmentalization of frameworks concerning maritime security that aren't necessarily being created in coordination with other frameworks, even next door. A framework is kind of like the structure surrounding a house. It's the beams, it's the concrete, it's the walls. And if each room is built without being part of an overall architectural plan, you're going to end up with a very strange house. And in some ways, that's exactly what has been happening across the continent and indeed across the globe. And so each of these rooms is being built, and maybe sometimes a whole floor is being built, but perhaps not with the idea of the whole house in mind. So when I said that at the beginning, that patchwork of frameworks was a problem, this is what I'm talking about. So let me go through some of the developments over the last few years in terms of African maritime security strategies and frameworks and show you where they do and don't match up. I think the umbrella framework that has to be lauded as being a tremendous statement of aspiration is the African Union's Africa Integrated Maritime Strategy 2050. It was published in January of 2014, and it sets out a vision for African continent-wide maritime security for the next several decades. It is focused primarily on two different elements: wealth creation and overcoming security challenges, present and future. It serves as an umbrella for the whole continent, but if we start looking at how that cascades down, that's where we start seeing where some of the challenges are going to lie over the coming years. I will focus primarily on West Africa in these remarks because it is perhaps the more developed portion of the continent in terms of regional frameworks. But this is true of the whole continent. In West Africa in 2013, so prior to the publishing of the Africa Integrated Maritime Strategy, the Yaoundé Code of Conduct really set forth a new approach to cooperation on the maritime security front. 26 nations came together and signed the Code of Conduct in June 2013 in order to really not just say that they were going to cooperate and collaborate on the maritime security front, but create the architecture and the infrastructure to do so. One of the main outcomes of that Code of Conduct is the creation of the Interregional Coordination Center, or CIC by its French acronym, in Yaoundé. The CIC is, in some ways, it's an intergovernmental organization. It is an organization whose members are ECOWAS, ECAS, and the Gulf of Guinea Commission. It is designed to provide all of the coordination for all of the maritime security activities in the regions from Senegal all the way down to Angola. It is a tremendously broad and ambitious undertaking, and the organization is right now getting stood up to its full capacity. It's going to take a while, but we're getting there. And the CIC has a mandate that is ambitious, and it is really oriented towards turning maritime security cooperation into a reality in the entire region. And while it was developed before the Africa Integrated Maritime Strategy, it actually sits very well within it. So it is complementary. So even though they don't match up in terms of time or sequence, they actually do work. Within the CIC, as I mentioned, we have ECOWAS, ECAS, and the Gulf of Guinea Commission, each of which have also published their own maritime strategies. The ECOWAS strategy came in March 2014, so after both the Integrated Maritime Strategy and the Code of Conduct. But the ECAS strategy actually predates all of this, and it dates back to 2008. Similarly, the Gulf of Guinea strategy, Gulf of Guinea Commission strategy dates to August 2013. So if I've confused you with all these dates, that was my intention, because it is a mess. It is not chronological, and if you were trying to draw it up perfectly, it wouldn't work. However, it doesn't mean it can't work. It means that the patchwork needs to be worked into a better framework so that it can all coordinate together. Now, one of the reasons, one of the ways, I guess, in which the coordination is starting to happen is actually at an even lower level. Maritime zones across the region have started the process of coordinating and collaborating at the operational and tactical levels. Zone D, which is Gabon, Cameroon, Sao Tome and Principe, and Equatorial Guinea, in 2009, started the process of the legalization of coordination with a technical accord. It is not a legal document, but it is the seeds for one, and it sets forth a mandate for actually sharing resources and sharing responsibilities for maritime security in that zone. Similarly, Zone E has followed suit and created a legally binding version of that same sort of technical agreement. So we're seeing at the zone level movement towards genuine cooperation, genuine coordination, and doing so in a legally binding fashion. Additionally, at the national level, states across the entire continent have started developing and publishing maritime strategies. Each of those now has the opportunity to be done with the overarching structure of the African Integrated Maritime Strategy, the interregional cooperation, the regional cooperation, the zonal cooperation in mind. So right now is a terrific time for states to be working on national strategies, because there's so much that can be done to start implementing the broader shared goals on maritime security. I've submitted to all of you a handout, and it actually goes through some of these different things. But I hope that that gives you a sense of what I mean by the patchwork of frameworks and the need to turn them into, over the next few years, a functional framework of frameworks. So let me move on to the point about the top and bottom being there, but the middle missing. I've mentioned that we have strategies and we have technical agreements. But where do we go in between? The strategies are not freestanding. They need to be turned into realities. And the technical agreements are great, but they are a starting point. And so what we have is the need to turn strategies into legally binding, functional frameworks that actually serve the purpose of creating genuine maritime security out on the water and prosecuting maritime crime successfully on land. So the legal frameworks are going to be necessary over the coming years to turn what are right now aspirations into very clear lines of responsibility for all actors involved in maritime security. And those lines of responsibility have to include very clear jurisdiction and authority so that everybody can genuinely do their job and the whole system can work. So we've got the top, we've got the bottom, the middle now has to happen, and it has to be legally binding. And finally, I want to focus on cooperation. Cooperation is something that seems quite obvious, but we have this expression in English that if something walks like a duck and it quacks like a duck, it must be a duck. Why do I bring this up? Well, cooperation is something that you kind of know it when you see it. And there's a danger that all the effort to create strategies and agreements and legally binding frameworks and accords will end up creating so much process that actually genuine cooperation gets lost in the mix. In other words, you cannot substitute an institution or an agreement or a piece of paper for actually working together. So cooperation has to actually be cooperative. You have to look at it and say, yes, that is cooperation. So it has to quack like a duck. No matter what the institutional, strategic, operational, legal, technical, or other developments that happen over the next few years, if it does not come together and work on the water, we've actually lost. And in some ways, it becomes wasted effort to have gone through all the processes. So the focus has to be on getting things to work. And part of that is understanding that not just within a country, and not just within a zone, and not just within a region, and not just within all of Africa even, we are all on the same team when it comes to maritime security. The maritime domain connects the entire world. There's a statistic or a set of statistics that's often cited in strategies. It's in the NATO maritime strategy, for example, that 70% of the Earth is covered in water. 80% of the world's population lives within 100 miles of the coast, and 90% of world commerce happens by sea. But I always point out that it misses the most important element, which is that 100% of the world's population lives on land. That means that what we do on land and what we do together is all connected via the water, and what happens on the water is all connected to us on land. So I encourage cooperation to be thought of at every level. intra-agency, interagency, whole of government, zonal, regional, interregional, and continent-wide, and ultimately globally. I thought I'd provide, by way of example, a few of the things that I've seen, not just in Africa, but around the world, where cooperation has broken down. And it's important to note that this is not an African challenge. This is a global challenge. And it's often where we least expect it that, that things break down, because we're just not looking for the whole picture when we try to fix a problem. In one country in which I've worked, the Coast Guard had been given tons of training. And I was briefed that they were extremely qualified and very capable to go out and do interdiction operations, to do search and rescue, to do patrols of all sorts, to arrest vessels. And when I went out and saw them, I found that they indeed were very operationally qualified. And yet they told me that they had not managed to arrest a single vessel for illegal fishing, which apparently was one of the biggest problems that the country faced. So I said, why is this? How can this be? They said, well, look, we've got all the capability in terms of operational ability on the water. We have radar and AIS tracking to be able to watch what's going on in the water, so we can see who's doing what. We can see fishermen, fishing vessels out on the water. I said, okay, so what's the problem? Well, the fisheries department refuses to give us a list of what vessels are licensed to fish in our waters. And so it came down to the simple fact that they had no idea which of the 70 boats that were fishing at any given time in their waters were on the list of 50 boats that were actually licensed. So they did not have the resources to go out and do interdiction of all vessels and check and see whether each boat had a license or not. And it was merely an issue of interagency cooperation, where all they needed was that piece of paper with the 55 vessels, and it would have sped up their operations and led to revenue streams from civil penalties for illegal fishing. And yet a disagreement between the two agencies prevented actual maritime security operations and cooperation. In another part of the world, I found a very interesting legal issue where the Coast Guard was allowed to detain but not arrest people who committed crimes on the water. The chief of police and the head of the Coast Guard had a personal disagreement at one point. And for a period, every time the Coast Guard detained people for illegal activity on the water and went to hand them over to the police let them go. It was a purely personal dispute. And so how can you build regional cooperation if you can't make it work interpersonally and interagency-wise? Finally, I worked in a country that has had more challenges than one could shake a stick at. And it is a very, very challenging place, not in Africa. And it got tons and tons of international attention, tons of money, tons of effort put towards creating a functional judicial system. Crimes occurred, the police became very good at arresting people, the prosecutors became very good at prosecuting people, and the judges became very good at putting them in jail. However, they had not focused at all on the final piece of the puzzle, the prison. And so a raid was done by a foreign military on the prison in this particular country. And they showed up, asked for a list of the people that were supposed to be there, and asked the warden to get all the inmates to come out and line up. And when they went through the list, they discovered that about 50% of the people who were on the list weren't in the prison, and about 50% of the people who were in the prison weren't on the list. And all the attention had gone to these other elements, to the police, to the prosecutors, to the judges. And nobody had thought to actually go and check and make sure that the prison system functioned. And so what was happening was somebody would commit a crime, they would get arrested, they would get prosecuted, they would get sentenced to jail, and on the way to the jail, they would go home. And somebody else would show up at the jail and do their service for them. And so the same day that they were sentenced to 10 years in prison or 20 years in prison, they were having dinner at home that night. And so in the context of cooperation, you have to look at the whole picture, and it has to work. So I will go back to my very beginning with the conclusions and say that we have a patchwork of frameworks. We need to work together to try and make that framework become, those frameworks become a functioning framework of frameworks. Second, in the infrastructure of maritime security cooperation, we're missing the middle, and that middle bit has to be legally grounded. And finally, cooperation must be cooperative. It has to work, and it has to quack like a duck. Thank you very much.